All right, well, in the previous video, I talked a bit about humanism. And I talked about it in fairly abstract terms. So what I want to do in this video is give you an idea, not only a better idea of what humanism is all about, but also to show you just how different humanists can be in terms of style, in terms of substance, in terms of aims. And the second purpose of this video really is just to provide you with a little bit of orientation for your primary source readings this week. Pico, Machiavelli, Erasmus. I want to tell you a little bit about these figures, but what they do have in common is that they're all humanists in their own way. So that's what this video is will hopefully accomplish. So let's start with Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, so he died quite young. He was one of the most famous Italian humanists in his time, a very impressive academic record, which I'll come back to in a moment. And he really, in many ways, represented the Renaissance ideal, an extremely broad education, especially in languages, and I stressed that in the last video. So what is it that we're reading here, this oration on the dignity of man? Well, in 1486, at the ripe old age of 23, Pico arrived in Florence, and he had written 900 theses, 900 arguments in the areas of philosophy, theology, and science, and he challenged all takers to come and dispute him on any one of these theses. And he wrote a little introduction or preface to his 900 theses, and that is the oration. So that is what we are actually reading for today. Now, as you read, you need to be thinking, okay, what makes Pico a Renaissance figure? Specifically, what makes him a humanism? And a humanist, as I suggested, humanism and Renaissance, these are virtually synonymous terms. Well, one thing that I think will become very clear to you as you read is that he was a highly educated person. He makes all sorts of references in the oration. And this reflects a truly unparalleled education. He studied church law at Bologna. He studied Greek and Platonism in Florence. He studied Hebrew and Arabic in Padua, and then finally philosophy and theology in Paris. I mean, this is a resume without rival in this time. And so you're going to find all these classical references and allusions in the oration. And interestingly, not only we find biblical references, not only we find classical references, but you'll find references to people like Muhammad and Persian thinkers. Okay, and so this bringing together, this weaving together of all these different references, I think reflects a kind of optimism that we find in many Renaissance figures. This idea that these different traditions of thought, the classical tradition, biblical tradition, perhaps other traditions as well, can in some way be reconciled and harmonized. Because Pico is not pitting these figures and traditions against each other. He is sort of finding the common ground between them. Speaking of optimism, we find that Renaissance individualism that I talked about in the last video, we find that in spades in Pico. I mean, the whole idea behind the oration is this notion that human beings have the most exalted place in the universe, precisely because we don't really have a place. We were created in the middle, meaning we are free to rise as high as we want or to sink as low as we want. You may mold yourself whatever form you choose, he says. So there's this infinite possibility, but it all depends on the individual, whether our potential will be maximized or, I should say, realized, or our potential will be squandered. Okay? So very individualistic way of thinking. We also see Renaissance secularism. Again, this doesn't mean that Pico is not religious. In fact, that's far from the case. But his main concern is, what are we going to make of ourselves here and now? And when he talks about elevating ourselves to the level of angels, he's not talking about something that's going on after death. He's talking about here and now. And finally, we certainly see activism in this text. This idea that we get to make ourselves, right? God gives us the clay, but we get to mold it. We are our own co-creators. In a sense, we determine our own nature. So there's this radical affirmation of human freedom. We have an unfettered choice, he says, to make of ourselves what we will. Now, of course, again, that supports what I was just saying about individualism, but also supports activism as well. This idea that we can really make a difference based on the choices that we make. So as you're reading the oration, look for those isms, those 5 Renaissance isms, and I think you'll find them all. So now we turn to another Italian author from the same period, Machiavelli. He had a longer life, 1459 to 1527. I'll just alert you to the fact that one of your discussion forum questions for this week has to do with Machiavelli. And the question is one that I hope will provoke some interesting responses. And I hope some disagreement. I mean, you guys should disagree with each other politely, at least from time to time. The question is Machiavelli just too cynical in his thinking about politics? Or is he just accurate? Is he just correct? And I don't want you to necessarily try to assess the entire reading, but focus on a particular point that he makes and really engage with that. All right, a little bit of background on Machiavelli. He was a Florentine. Again, Florence is really where it's at during this period, especially in the 15th century. And he had a very promising political career early in his life. 1494, he became an official in the Florentine Republic. He was later promoted and carried out over 30 diplomatic missions. So he got to travel, he got to engage in diplomacy. Then things take a turn for the worse for him. In 1512, the Republic in Florence kind of falls apart. The Medici, who had been expelled from the city, they return, they assume power again, and Machiavelli had gotten on their bad side. So there are little echoes of Dante here, right? For political reasons, he is exiled from Florence, and he is sort of forced to live a life of leisure in one of his family estates outside the city. Now, he was not happy about this at all because he loved being, right in the middle of the political mix, but it gave him the leisure to write the book that would one day make him famous. It wouldn't make him famous in his own day because the book was not published until after his death. He wrote The Prince in 1513, but the book was not published for almost 10 years after that. Why that is something to consider as you read. I mean, I hope if you read Machiavelli carefully, you should be able to figure out why he was a controversial writer then and is now still. Well, eventually he gets back into the good graces of the Medici, and the Prince itself is really a kind of act of flattery directed to the Medici. The book is dedicated to Lorenzo II de' Medici, who was the grandson of the famous Lorenzo the Magnificent, about whom you'll read in West in the World. And so he does, this is successful. He does get back in the good graces of the Medici. He's allowed to re-enter Florence and also to re-enter the political realm, and begins doing sort of diplomatic work again. But yet again, things go awry. In 1527, German mercenaries sacked the city of Rome. The Pope had to lock himself up in his own castle to protect himself. And yet again, the Florentines forced the Medici to leave. And Machiavelli himself died in that year, 1527. So why is Machiavelli important? Machiavelli is important because he arguably invented a discipline that is still studied at institutions like Milligan College today, which is political science. Remember what I said in the previous lecture about realism. Okay? Machiavelli thinks that politics should be studied and written about, but based on actual observation of how politics really works in the present as well as the past. In other words, political philosophy, or as we might say today, political science, ought not to be the study of the way politics ought to work in an ideal world, but rather political dynamics as they actually exist in this rather rotten world in which we live. So in many ways, I mean, there have been works of political philosophy written before the Prince. The Republic, Plato, of course, is a famous example of political philosophy, written almost 2,000 years before Machiavelli. But what does Plato do in the Republic? Plato sort of fantasizes, if you will, about what the ideal republic would look like. And Machiavelli thinks that's just a waste of time, okay? Because we don't live in an ideal world. The ideal republic will never be realized. So what's the best we can do in the world in which we actually live? Let's look at how power is actually gained and maintained, and let's base our political advice on that. Okay. So realism, again, is going to be a very striking trait of the Republic. So as you read, the realism, I think, is going to be very obvious. But as you read Machiavelli, look for those other isms too, because he's just as much of a Renaissance figure as somebody like Pico. So I think you're going to see elements of individualism in Machiavelli. You're going to see certainly elements of secularism. Okay? Not once will Machiavelli stop and say, now wait a minute, if the prince actually behaves this way, what are his chances of getting into heaven? This is above Machiavelli's pay grade. This is not what Machiavelli is concerned about. Machiavelli is concerned with helping princes wield power effectively. He is not concerned in any way with the fate of their immortal soul. Finally, I think you'll also see ample evidence that Machiavelli was very much a humanist. A humanist is somebody who turns to the ancient world, who turns to classical antiquity for inspiration. And he's going to do that several times. I'm not going to tell you how he does that. I'm going to make you look for that. But I'll assure you that he does, in fact, do that. So, I think if you read Machiavelli and Pico back to back, you're not going to mistake one for the other. Okay? These are very different writers. And yet, both of them, every inch of them, is Renaissance, is humanist. So be looking for those things. Finally, Erasmus. Okay. Now, Erasmus will actually take us, for the first time in our study of the Renaissance, outside of Italy. His dates, by the way, are circa 1467 to 1536, so roughly a contemporary of Machiavelli. You'll read in West in the World this week that even though, without question, the Renaissance begins as an Italian phenomenon, it will spread into much of the rest of Europe, especially Northern Europe. Places like the Netherlands, which is where Erasmus was from, places like England become major centers of humanist thought and activity. Now, humanism is going to spread, is going to be sort of exported from Italy. But the kind of humanism that really takes root in places like the Netherlands and England is not going to be identical in every respect to Italian humanism. And Western the world brings this out. Northern humanists like Erasmus were much more acutely concerned with the reform of the church. Now, that's not to say that Italian humanists had no interest in that whatsoever, but it was not one of their principal animating concerns. Whereas for somebody like Erasmus, humanism holds great promise because humanism might sort of lead to the reform of Christianity, which is badly needed in the mind of somebody like Erasmus. So Northern humanism, as exemplified by somebody like Erasmus, is often simply dubbed Christian humanism. Okay? And again, that just drives home the point that at this time in the Renaissance, humanism, that term, carries no anti-religious connotations whatsoever. All right, so what makes Erasmus a Christian humanist? Well, he really advocated a return to the sources of the Christian faith. Remember, returning to the sources, that was sort of the main idea of the humanist. And Erasmus loved the works of classical pagan antiquity, but he also believed in going back to the sources of the Christian faith. And again, as I said in the previous video, that means primarily the Bible and the works of the church fathers, people like Augustine and Jerome. And Erasmus was really, he didn't just call for this. I mean, he did this. He was a scholar's scholar. He was responsible for publishing the very first edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516. Printing press is not quite 100 years old at this point, but he supervises the first printing of the Greek text of the New Testament. He also published a 6-volume edition of the works of Jerome, the great church father. Okay? So he is actively trying to disseminate these works. But again, as I said, this doesn't mean he had no interest in pagan antiquity as well. He published an edition of Cicero's letters, for example. So he's doing all this very scholarly work, but there's another side of Erasmus, and that is the sort of popular satirical side, which we are going to see this week. He wrote a lot of satires. Many of them were satires of the church of his day. I mean, he thought in many ways the church of his day was in sorry shape. But we have to be very careful here, especially as we approach our study of the Protestant Reformation, which we will undertake next week. You have to remember, as you were reading the satirical text, Julius Excluded, this week, that Erasmus was not anti-Catholic. He can't be anti-Catholic because he was Catholic by choice until his dying day. Now, he desperately wanted the Roman Catholic Church to reform itself, okay? And he had some sympathy with some of the ideas of Protestant reformers like Luther. But he was different from them in many ways, and it would seem that Erasmus was never seriously tempted to leave the fold of the Roman Catholic Church. So he does not pull any punches in his rather vicious satire of the Pope, but do not falsely infer from that he is anti-Catholic. It's simply not the case. All right, so what do you need to know about this text by him you're reading? It's called Julius Excluded, or Julius Exclusus in Latin, so it's even snappier that way. Written sometime in the mid to late 15 teens, 15, 17, 15, 18, something like that. Erasmus actually never owned up to having written the piece, but there's really no debate among scholars. Everyone believes that Erasmus is the author. And it was a very popular work. It went through 13 different editions in 4 years. It was translated into all sorts of languages and so on. The work is a satire of Julius II, Pope Julius II, who was Pope at the time, who was recently Pope. I don't think Erasmus is just picking on Julius II here. I think for him, Julius II typifies what is wrong with virtually all of the popes of Erasmus's day. Now, Julius II is a very important historical figure in his own right. He was a great patron of the arts. He was a friend and patron of people like Michelangelo and Raphael. He was also famously the warrior pope, who would often sort of go out on the front lines with the papal army, because the papacy did have its own army during this day, and was very involved in military endeavors, which Erasmus is going to make a big deal of in this writing. He is the same Julius, incidentally, who is praised by Machiavelli. Now, when Machiavelli praises you, Machiavelli may be sincere, but that's not necessarily a good sign that Machiavelli thinks that you're a great leader. So just be on the lookout for that. I will say, looking ahead to next week, this is one of those points where the Renaissance and the Reformation will meet, because Julius II is the one who laid the first stone of the new St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, and he was also responsible for launching an indulgence campaign to help raise money for the building of this new church. And it's precisely that indulgence campaign that spurs Martin Luther into action. Again, don't worry about all that right now. We'll talk about that next week. But I just want to make the point that we are getting very close to the Protestant Reformation here, and there are some interesting intersections between the Renaissance and the Reformation. I'll conclude with this. I want you to look for this as you read. One of the major criticisms that Erasmus has of the papacy of his day, and again, for Erasmus, it's not just the papacy. I think it's just church leaders in general. It's bishops and cardinals as well. One of the big beefs Erasmus has with them is their apparent utter lack of interest in the early church and in the writings of the early church. And you'll see, Erasmus will really sort of ridicule Julius for this in our reading. And this, of course, is perfectly in keeping with Erasmus's humanism, his belief that Christians ought to look back to the original sources of Christianity, the Bible, the writing of the church fathers, preferably in the original languages, for inspiration. Okay? So you want to know how to be a Christian, you want to know what the Christian life looks like, the best thing you can possibly do is to read the Bible, to read the church fathers, not necessarily to look to bishops and popes and cardinals and see how they're behaving. In fact, that might be the worst thing you could do. The best thing you could do is to go back to the original sources. So that is very much in line with Erasmus's overall humanist bent. All right, I hope you'll enjoy the readings. Again, they're all very different, but I hope you have enough now to really appreciate what each of these authors is striving